over to you, Abby.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone's doing well. I'm gonna put the source sheet in the chat for now. I know that there's a lot of activity in the chat, so just keep your eye out. Also, I just clicked enter, so everyone can click on that source sheet. And as you may know, Mara will send out a PDF after the class. The access to the source sheet will be closed after the class, but you'll receive a PDF. And as Mara said, I will try and keep my eye on the chat a little bit, but mostly I'm looking at you, looking at the source sheet, and focused on listening and thinking. So welcome again. This week's Parsha Torah portion is Vaetchanan, which means, and I pleaded. And I'll go ahead and share my screen so those of you who prefer can also see the screen share. Okay. So there is a lot in this week's second Torah portion of Deuteronomy to talk about. There's a lot of different choices. I'll mention something that we won't be talking about, we won't be focused on, but it is really interesting to look into. The Shema, the passage that is translated often as, "Hear Israel, hear, O Israel, listen, Israel. God is our God, God is one." We find that in this week's Torah portion. And as you may know, the Shema line has become a key declaration of monotheism, and we find it in the morning prayers, the evening prayers, bedtime Shema. It's supposed to be a line that we say upon our deathbeds in emergency situations. So it really is a prevalent declaration that's become part of our prayers and our ritual life. And it's really interesting to take a look at the Shema, different translations of the Shema, to see what you might be able to glean from that. Today, there's also the repeat of the 10 Commandments that we find in the book of Exodus. So we're going to take a look together at the commandments. And I want us to, you can see here, there are a few questions that I highlighted, and I'm gonna number those so you can see them a little more carefully. What are some essentials about the 10 Commandments, some essential ideas? What is useful for us today? What's the purpose of the 10 Commandments? What's the significance for us today? So I want us similar questions, but I want us to be thinking together about all of those things. Okay, so I'm gonna see if I can. Also, I want to mention, just in case people who haven't studied with me don't know, my second monitor is kind of behind and above. So I'm looking at that, and I will enlarge the sheet. I did see that. Thank you. And you can also enlarge your screen on your own monitor. So I'll encourage you to size as you see fit, but I will also certainly make it bigger here. So, okay, there we go. So what we're going to do together is read the commandments out loud, reflect on them, and also think about comparing them to the Exodus version, and look at one key difference, and also talk about, again, what are some essentials that we can glean from the 10 Commandments. And we'll read both a text that might be considered radical, a modern text, and also a traditional commentary, Rashi. And then I'll also suggest some modern ways to look at the text. So I want to mention that in the book of Deuteronomy, when scholars look at the book, they consider the book as consisting of four separate speeches by Moses, by Moshe, to the Israelites before they enter into the land of Israel. And we're still in this second Torah portion, we're still in the first speech of Moses. So as you make your way through Deuteronomy, you can take a look at, Google some outlines and see what speech we're actually in. Okay. I'm just adjusting a couple things on my screen here. Okay. All right. So we're going to read out loud the 10 commandments, and you'll see that in brackets are the commandment numbers, which are a little different than we might expect. The organization, our traditional understanding of the way that the 10 are split up at the beginning, at least, is a little confusing, but we'll go ahead and read those together. And I'll ask you really today to think about what are the essentials? What are the underlying ideas? What's the purpose of these? What can we do with these commandments today? So I'll invite someone to read. So if someone could raise their hand. Okay, Ginny, thank you so much. You can go ahead and unmute, and you can read in English and people can follow along in Hebrew.
I am the Lord your God. I'm the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt, the house of slaves. You shall have no other gods beside me. You shall not make for yourself a sculptured image, any likeness of what is in the heavens above, or on the earth below, or in the waters below the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am an impassioned God, visiting the guilt of the parents upon the children, upon the third and upon the fourth generations of those who reject me, but showing kindness to the thousandth of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not swear falsely by the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not clear one who swears falsely by his name. Observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy, as the Lord your God has commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your ox or your ass, or any of your cattle, or the stranger in your settlements, so that your male and female slaves may rest as you do. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God freed you from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day.
Okay, Ginny, I'll just ask you to pause there for a moment and then you'll continue in just a moment. Thank you so much for your reading so far. So those of you that are familiar with the 10 commandments, and I saw a brief note in the chat, it is interesting to note that in Deuteronomy, we don't, or in Exodus, these statements are not referred to as commandments. In Deuteronomy, they're referred to as devarim, things or words, or statements. And the rabbis, in their development of Judaism after the time of the Torah, they developed the language of Aseret HaDibrot in the plural, in the feminine rather than in the singular, Dibrot rather than Dvarim. The first statement is really that, a statement, not a commandment. So oftentimes when people study or teach the 10 commandments, they refer to them as Aseret HaDibrot to be a little bit more accurate. I think our common parlance is commandments, so I've been using that, but I did want to mention that. And also you'll see here, those of you that are familiar, the first group of commandments is really about our relationship to God, our relationship, our spiritual relationship. We're not going to go into so much detail right now about what each of the commandments means, but I just want us to see the bird's eye view, the bigger picture here, that right now what we seem to be talking about is the relationship that we have, our spiritual relationship, and included in that is Shabbat, resting, appreciating what's around us. And we will talk more about that one in a few moments. And the fifth commandment about honoring our parents, interestingly enough, is in the first five, which are really about primarily about something spiritual. But some people say that, honoring our parents is sort of a first step in honoring authority, honoring God, the spiritual authority in our lives. And so honoring our parents is grouped really with the first half of the commandments. Okay, so I'll let Ginny read a little bit more and then I'll open it up. I'll say a couple more things and open it up for conversation. Okay, Ginny, thank you so much for your continued reading.
Honor your father and your mother, as the Lord your God has commanded you, that you may long endure and that you may fare well in the land that the Lord your God is assigning to you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor.
Okay, Ginny, thank you so much. So as you can see, the commandments that Ginny read, and I'll include 5 in that, even though I qualified that a little bit differently a few moments ago, are really about these sort of key interpersonal laws, and we'll talk about that in a moment. You'll see that I wrote here in Hebrew for those of you that know Hebrew and know this terminology. And for those of you that don't, I'm about to share with you that I mentioned that the first group are really spiritually focused. And in traditional rabbinic parlance, we call that Bein Adam le Makom. Makom is one of the names that the rabbis use to refer to God. It means source or place. Some people find that a nice kind of non-anthropomorphic meaning, like thinking about this ultimate source for perhaps for goodness, and bein adam lechavero, between a person and their friend. So already I think something fairly obvious about these commandments or statements is that they ask us to really check in with ourselves. Where are we in our spiritual lives? Where are we in our interpersonal lives? What can we do better? I'll suggest that maybe each of these, the specifics of the commandments, we don't have to perhaps take as literally some of them as we would have, perhaps as our ancestors would have 2,500 years ago. But the idea that we have certain key touchstones for thinking about where we are, checking in with ourselves every time we read the 10 Commandments, perhaps at a minimum, when we read them in the book of Exodus in the wintertime, and when we read them in the summertime in the book of Deuteronomy, this is an opportunity to check in with ourselves more globally. Where are we spiritually? Are we where we want to be? And where are we interpersonally? And I'll also suggest, before I open it up for conversation, that we read this Torah portion every year after Tisha B'Av, or some of you might know the traditional Ashkenazic pronunciation, Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, the day that we just had this week that commemorates not just the destruction of both temples, but also over time, it became a day to mourn many destructions in communal Jewish life, in the life of the Jewish people. And the rabbis say that we understand the destruction of the Second Temple as a destruction that resulted from our lack of kindness to one another. Also the First Temple, but there's a famous story about the lack of interpersonal skills in something that precipitated the destruction of the temple. And so every year after the 9th of Av, we're being asked to think about, okay, so how do we move forward? I can't resist sharing one more thing. Some of you may be familiar with the book that Sarah Hurwitz wrote called Here All Along. It's a fantastic introduction to Judaism, a very deep, beautiful treatise on understanding Judaism in the modern age. And she actually, I think she may quote Rabbi Alan Liu, but I'm not certain. She does talk about the way in which Tisha B'Av metaphorically, not just literally, is about the breaking down of the walls, but the beginning of the high holiday process, where we begin to work on breaking down our internal walls and to ask ourselves these big questions. Again, where are we spiritually? How do we want to improve? And where are we interpersonally? And of course, in traditional Judaism, we argue that those things are to some degree part of the same thing. So I want to pause here just after looking at reading the commandments together, thinking about the spiritual versus earthly distinction. And I want to hear from a few of you how you might connect to these dibrot or dvarim or commandments, and also if this idea that perhaps it's just reading the Ten Commandments is an opportunity to ask ourselves the questions, where are we spiritually? Where are we interpersonally? And what do we want to work on as we begin to prepare for the high holidays? So I'm going to pause here and hopefully take 2 or 3 reflections or questions to begin our conversation together.
Sure. People are welcome to raise their hands, but I just saw in the chat, Ara wrote that they struggle with defining murder. And I think like a lot of these terms can make us ask, like, what does that mean? You know, how do we define each of these things that we both should do and shouldn't do?
Okay, thank you. Let's take a couple more. Maya, I see your hand raised. You can go ahead and unmute if you're able to. Great.
Yeah, I accidentally pressed something. So
Okay,
yeah,
no problem.
so in Israel, the religious right of, as far as I remember, always uses the ninth of Av as a cross jewel, is a hammer. In Israeli Hebrew, we have a saying that translates as a hatchet to dig in, against their enemies, the Jews that disagree with them, that they blame us for being divisive and stuff.
Okay. Okay, let me take one more and then I'll try and respond to all of them. Okay, I see Arnold, your hand.
Yes, hi, thank you.
Hi, sure.
I guess I'm just thinking about the first 4 commandments and relating it to modern day Hindu or Buddhist, where images of the gods are just plentiful, and I'm wondering how in modern days these things relate to that. I know it's not monotheistic, but I just was kind of fascinated by that comparison.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if this will answer your question, but there really is a very strict prohibition in the Hebrew Bible against creating images and sculptured images in particular, but that was extended. You can see here in the next part of the verse, any likeness at all. I would say from a more rationalist or Maimonidean perspective, the idea of not creating a specific image of what God looks like, and even though the Bible does that in a lot of other places in anthropomorphizing God and God speaking, God is described as having a strong arm that takes the Israelites out of slavery. But nevertheless, here we're being asked to really think about God, a higher power, in an amorphous kind of way. And again, I mentioned in the kind of rationalist Maimonidean tradition, really not doing our best not to think about God as human-like. And I would say that's some of us might like that about Judaism, and it is different than other religions. And I think it was different than what the Israelites were seeing around them in the Israelite scholars talk about how the Israelites emerged out of the Canaanite nations around them. And those nations clearly did have figurines, idols. And some people even acknowledge that, and we see this in the prophetic text, that the Israelites certainly did seem to worship other gods, but over time, in the Second Temple period in particular, they began, the Jews that developed out of the Israelites began to see a more amorphous God. And then by the time we get to Maimonides, Maimonides says that we can only talk about God in what God is not, in the negative. And Maimonides also talks about God as knowledge, as the ultimate knowledge. But he says specifically, every time a metaphor is, every time we speak about God's body or God's voice in some way in human terms, it's a metaphor. So, that's one clear approach in Judaism to this amorphous God that is based here, that is based in these verses in the Bible, which some people might like and some people might not. Some people might appreciate the human-like characterizations of God. In terms of the other comments, Maya, I don't know if I understood 100% what you were saying, but I think what you were saying is that in Israel, it sounded like to me that some people actually maybe use Tisha B'Av as an opportunity to do the opposite of what it's meant to do. But regardless, really the idea from our tradition is that Tisha B'Av should be a wake-up call based on the rabbinic text of how our treatment of one another, how we treat each other with respect or disrespect contributes to how we create a reality for ourselves based on either respect or disrespect. And of course, we do know that the ancient temples historically were destroyed by the ancient Near Eastern power, the Babylonians, and by the Romans later for the Second Temple. And there was power and politics at play, but the rabbis are asking us to think inward about our role in creating reality in the way that we treat other people. And in terms of the first question about the specifics of murder, I don't know what more to say about that honestly right now, but it is pretty clear here that these are all what I think the Torah considered these part of our covenant with each other in society, that these are things that keep us together. I didn't quote here, but there's and I don't remember her name, but a scholar on the Torah.com, a website that I've used and quoted many other times before, talks about these as not, and also I think I'm combining an Eitz Chaim commentary. In other ancient Near Eastern codes, we often see if-then. If you do this, this is the punishment. And we find that in other places in the Torah here. But these commandments are really supposed to, say some scholars, not necessarily be if-then, but they're really supposed to be core values in order to keep us together as a society. We're supposed to be monogamous and honest with our partners. We're not supposed to murder. We're not supposed to take from one another. We're not even, oh goodness, I have to add, I'm missing number 10 here, which is not to covet. I have to add that. We're supposed to, and as we'll see in a moment, we're even supposed to take care of our own, I would extend this in modern language, our own mental health, so that we're not in a place where we're coveting what other people want. And that's also considered a core element of being in a society together, so that we don't act out, appreciating what we have, who we are, what we have to offer. So I think that's also a perspective to think about. And in terms of, it's a little more complicated when we get to the spiritual, the Bein Adam L'Makom, but these really represent core values, or I would say also, again, core questions that we can ask ourselves whenever we read these. Okay, so I want to keep going with a little bit more text. Joel, I think I see you waving your hands, but we'll try and come back to you after we break again. So I want to just read to add to our perspectives on the 10 Commandments. We're going to actually skip this for now. But actually, first, I want to show you Rashi, the 11th century, early 11th century French commentator that really revolutionized and made Torah study much more accessible to the people, as opposed to just keeping it as a rabbinic endeavor. And Rashi says, just highlighting here, all the 613 commandments are implicitly contained in the 10 commandments. The idea that, again, these are really core values, and any commandment that we see later in the Torah can be categorized as part of one of the commandments here. And from a totally different writer, but I think an interesting piece for us to read and think about is this passage from Rabbi Sherwin Wine, who was the founder of humanistic Judaism. He started the movement in Detroit, which is actually my hometown. And we're going to read this text together and see, even if you disagree with him, see what we can glean in our understanding and our approach to the 10 Commandments in modern ways. So I want to invite another reader. Someone could volunteer to read. That would be great. who would like to be a reader? Okay, Ginny, let me just see. Thank you so much. Let me see if anybody else wants to read, and otherwise we'll ask you to read again. Okay, that's great. Thank you so much. Oh, I see. It was a different Ginny. I'm sorry. Okay. Ginny Tucker, let's go with you. And Beth, hopefully you'll be able to get your voice in another time. Okay, 2 Ginnies reading for us today. Ginny Tucker.
Okay, text 3. The agenda of dignity and the agenda of justice are reinforced by 4 evolutionary realities. The first is compassion or empathy, the power we have to feel and identify with the pains and pleasure of others. Some people have great capacity for empathy, many do not. Where compassion is scarce, so is ethics. You want me to read the next sentence?
Yeah,
or?
keep going. Yeah, keep going.
The second is guilt. Guilt is a unique feeling younger than fear, anger, or love that owes its existence to the social nature of human existence. Natural selection tends to eliminate sociopaths and offer survival rewards to those who share and cooperate. Too much guilt is destructive of dignity and personal happiness, but no guilt dissolves the social bonds that make life possible. The third is the powerful connection that human social networks foster. It rests on the implicit promise that mutual dependency encourages. These promises are the social contract that underlies human relations. We choose to take help and support from friends and strangers. The act of asking implies our obligation to give help and support. The fourth is the irony of self-esteem. People who work to be masters of their own lives do not cling to their possessions desperately. Such attachments are signs of weakness and limit the boldness that is necessary to self-esteem.
Okay, thank you so much, Ginny. Okay, so I think this is just an interesting take for us to think about as we encounter the 10 Commandments on a regular basis, thinking about these 4 evolutionary realities, almost, I'm going to say, 4 values that underlie perhaps the 10 Commandments: compassion and empathy, the idea that we can't hurt someone else in any way. We certainly would not want our own selves to be hurt. Guilt, the idea that the reality is sometimes in a social contract, guilt does motivate us. But perhaps more powerfully, the idea that we have a social contract, that we're connected with one another, even if we don't know each other, and we owe each other something. The covenant between Israel and God is also about having a covenant between human beings, according to the 10 Commandments I'm suggesting. And very interestingly, Sherwin-Wine includes this idea of self-esteem, that in order to, as the 10th commandment that I have to add there, about not coveting, the idea that we have to try and be happy in our own lives, and we have to be as grounded and as happy as possible in order to be as useful and to contribute to society as much as possible. So the idea of self-care that is so prevalent in today's society is not only about taking care of ourselves, but about the effect that it has in our relationships with other people. So I want to pause here and see and hear from some of you and hear how this text may resonate or may not resonate with you. Hey, Joel, you had your hands up before. You can go ahead and unmute.
Oh, you remuted. 1 second.
Oh,
Can you hear me, Abby?
yes, thank you, Joel.
Okay, I always was under the impression that action is more important than the belief system. That here you have guidance, but you got to take action.
Yeah.
You have to do it.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. I think it's interesting that in the 10 statements, we have both a combination of beliefs and action, but really belief is just the first statement. I would say you're correct. Overall, in Judaism, action is definitely emphasized. It doesn't mean beliefs aren't there too, and we do have Maimonides' 13 principles of faith. But generally, dogma is not necessarily as prevalent in Judaism as it is in other religions, and actions in the here and now. That is what's emphasized. Again, not to the exclusion of belief, but indeed, action is emphasized. And I think, Joel, actually, you make a good point in the context of the Aseret HaDibrot, 10 commandments or statements, that action is what's emphasized here. The way, and again, I have to add this, I don't know, I accidentally deleted the 10th commandment, but the idea of not coveting, the rabbis understand that as action, interestingly, not acting based on jealousy or based on envy. And it's true, it's hard to dictate a commandment, but the idea of, and I see there's a little bit about this in the chat, the idea of really becoming grounded in who we are and in ourselves is important in allowing us to take action in positive ways in our society. Okay, Arnold, I do see your hands up, but I want to give someone else the opportunity to ask a question or share, add your voice to the conversation. Joel, thank you again. Okay, would anyone else like to feel free to unmute, share a reflection or question? I know there's a lot going on in the chat, but I haven't been able to see very much of, so I'd certainly welcome someone to unmute. Okay, so one of the questions on the table at the moment is, does this passage that we read, the idea of these 4 evolutionary realities, does that resonate, or do you see the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 commandments, in a different way? Okay, I'll give people another moment, and if not, Arnold, go ahead. Why don't you jump in? Do you have something that you want to share? And Arnold, you can go ahead and
Okay,
unmute.
sorry.
There you go. No problem. No problem.
His line about natural selection tends to eliminate sociopaths.
Yeah,
He may be right,
maybe.
but I just think about whenever we meet a sociopath or useless, like the 10 Commandments are, like it's hard to believe in things when you just meet the sociopath and realize the power they see.
Arnold, you're cutting in and out. It's hard to hear you. It sounds like maybe your Wi-Fi is you're breaking up a little bit. So I don't know if there's anything you can do about that, but I think I'm just gonna kind of reflect a little bit on what you said here, which is, yeah, this is, I forget the year this was written, maybe the 90s, maybe a little earlier, but it does seem like a little dated, or maybe I also had a reaction to that piece. It's not bolded, as you can see. Yeah, I'm not sure how that, I think that definitely, like, I don't know what to do with that line. So but it also didn't ring entirely true for me. Okay, I want to share just a couple more things as we begin to wrap up. First of all, I do want to share, there's one of the most famous differences that I want to leave us with that I think ties in to what the 10 Commandments are inviting us to think about, is one of the differences between the 10 Commandments, really the key difference, in the list of 10 Commandments in Exodus versus here in Deuteronomy. And this document, I don't think, let me just find the all English one. Okay, so you don't have access to this one. This is just something that I'm showing on screen. You can see that here in the book of Exodus, is the commandment to remember the seventh day, whereas here in Deuteronomy, the commandment is to observe the seventh day. And the reason for Shabbat, for resting, is different in Exodus and Deuteronomy. Here, the reason is that we were given the seventh day in order to connect with the way in which God rested, to remember that in the creation story, God also took a rest. God worked hard and rested. And so we're supposed to, as the famous two words, imitatio Dei, share with us, we're supposed to imitate God in that way also. On the other hand, the commandment in Deuteronomy, in our Torah portion this week, is about observing shamor versus zachor in Hebrew. And really what we're supposed to remember here is a little different. Verse 15 says, remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God freed you from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. So on the one hand, in the book of Exodus, we're called on to frame Shabbat in a spiritual kind of way. God rested, so we rest, and we're kind of connecting upwards. And when we think about the directions in the book of Deuteronomy about observing, what we're asked to do is actually observe in order to allow others to rest. Not just, you can see in verse 14, it's not just me that gets to rest. It's if I have a household with animals, with slaves, as the Bible did allow for some kind of slavery, anyone has to, in my household, any living being has to be able to rest on Shabbat. And the reason for this, what underlies it, is empathy. I know in my own DNA is the idea of slavery that was unethical and that didn't allow for rest. And here in the book of Deuteronomy, indeed, as I shared, slavery is allowed in the Hebrew Bible. But the commandment of Shabbat is that if you have a slave, if you have an animal, your whole family, no one, you're not the only one that gets to rest. Every living being, everyone, everything that breathes deserves to rest. And it's a much more earthly and justice-focused commandment. And so again, we have this constant reminder, even when we compare the commandments, that there's both this earthly kind of action-oriented, as Joel was sharing, these very earthly action-oriented statements or commandments, and I would say more so questions, things that we're prompted to think about in today's world. And at the same time, we're being asked to think upwards or outwards, to think spiritually. Where are we spiritually? Are we giving ourselves rest? And included in your packet is, let me find, here we go, is this passage from Rabbi Ethan Tucker from the Hadar Institute, Machon Hadar, where he really beautifully talks about how we know we're living in a culture today of incessant work and the idea of resting, but also the idea of imitating God's behavior and thinking about our relationship to the physical world of creation. Both those things are what the Torah is asking us to think about. So I want to just invite any final comments at this moment on really just generally thinking about our spiritual lives and our earthly, our interpersonal lives as we encounter the 10 Commandments, and especially this year as we are living in a difficult world that has changed over the past year for us quite a bit. And as we enter into the high holidays, thinking about what we can do in a difficult world to make not just our lives better, but the lives of those around us better through grounding ourselves in spiritual teachings and spirituality, and also building our intra and interpersonal skills to have a positive effect on the world around us. So I'm curious as we wrap up here where people are landing. And before I call on Lori, whose hand is raised here, I'll just call your attention to the final text here, which we're not going to read out loud now, but in blue you can see, and these are actually from Exodus. The commandments are from Exodus, revisited. What are some ways of looking at the 10 commandments here with some modern kinds of questions? So Lori, I'll invite you to share briefly, and Michael, and then if I don't think we'll have time, then we'll wrap up, but if we do, we'll invite Paul's comment. So Lori, you can go ahead and unmute and share.
Lori, to unmute, I just want to make a note about the chat. Thank you all for being here. We have a really wide and diverse group here, and we want to respect everyone's opinions, and especially when we're talking about the 10 Commandments, it's very hard to not jump into policy and politics. I just want to reiterate that the chat is not necessarily a place for those kinds of important conversations. And so as we unmute, I just invite you to talk about the text. Thank you. Laurie.
Mara, Laura, thank you.
Hi, thank you. Our focus has been on the 10 Commandments, of course, but I just wanted to point out the poignancy of Moses's interaction with God, where God is telling him, you don't get to go. You don't get to go across the Jordan. You can look around, but you don't get to go. And it's very poignant. And, your work is done. You've done it good. I mean, you still have to tell people a lot of things, but you don't get to go. And I think in terms of generational just changes and whatever, that's just a very poignant part of this parsha.
Yeah, okay. Lori, thank you. Thank you. Michael Reiter. You can go ahead and unmute. Michael, we'll go on to Paul.
No,
there we go.
late.
Michael,
Finally.
go. Okay, go ahead.
I got to make this question. This is probably too late at the time, but when you use the term spirituality, Abby, what do you mean exactly?
Yeah, I would not define it right now. I think we all define that a little bit differently, but I would say if I wanted to add a little bit of a description here, I would say that the 10 Commandments ask us to think about where we are in terms of our relationship with God or a higher power or a core set of ethics or unitedness or unity among ourselves. People define that differently, but that's what I would add just as a final thought there. And then Paul, we'll go ahead and hear your final comment here, and then it'll be wrapped up. Michael, I'll ask you to go ahead and mute, please. Okay, Paul. Just you get the last. Okay, Paul, if you're able to unmute.
We are.
Okay, very briefly, because we want to respect everyone's time and end on time.
Well, thank you, Abby. Yeah, the 10 Commandments, I think there was an evolution, a reform of sorts. And, but what I think is, constant is that the 10 Commandments, what they represent is that we as part of the covenant hold ourselves to a really high standard. So that hasn't changed. And as challenging as the world is for us today, we have to continue to keep that in mind, at least in my opinion, that we have to always hold ourselves to a high standard.
Beautiful. It's a beautiful note to end on. The standard that the 10 Commandments and the Torah sets for us in general, that we should, that is always something that we should be aiming for a higher and higher, I'm going to use the word spirituality, sense of spirituality and interpersonal relationships. So that's a great way to end. Thank you so much, Paul. And thank you again to everyone for being here and for participating and for sharing all your thoughts and ideas this morning. And I'll wish you all Shabbat Shalom, a peaceful Shabbat and weekend ahead.
Thank you so much, Abby. And just as a reminder to everyone, we will be sending out the recording along with the source sheet. We ended on a wonderful note of what it looks like to aspire to be better. We are diving in the next 6 weeks we're doing a Haftorah study, which is on the book of the prophets. And I'm adding that to the chat. So if you're interested in learning Haftorah with us, or learning a little bit more about what the Haftorah means, or getting insights on what it means to be a good person from the prophets, please consider joining us. We will include that in the follow-up as well. And thank you for letting me chit chat and end with announcements. And I echo Abby. Shabbat Shalom. Be well. Bye-bye.